The A-10 Thunderbolt II limped into Bagram airfield just before dawn, trailing smoke like a wounded animal dragging itself to shelter. Ground crews scrambled across the tarmac as the aircraft touched down with a screech that sent sparks showering into the darkness. When the canopy finally cracked open, there was no pilot inside. Just an empty ejection seat, harness dangling, and a flight suit collar stained with something dark. The aircraft had flown itself home. Hydraulics were shot. The right engine was held together by what looked like prayers and duct tape. Over 300 bullet holes peppered the fuselage, wings, and tail section. But somehow, impossibly, the Warthog had crawled back across 200 miles of hostile Afghan mountains without a soul at the controls. The tower logs showed her last transmission had come in 47 minutes earlier, fractured and distant. Hawkeye 7-3, taking fire, multiple systems critical, then nothing. Static. Silence that stretched across the Hindu Kush like a held breath. Her name was Captain Lyra Kairos. Call sign, Revenant. 31 years old, Marine Corps aviator, 5 deployments, and a reputation for being too aggressive, too stubborn, too unwilling to back down when things got hot. The kind of pilot who flew low and slow on purpose, daring the enemy to take their best shot while she painted targets for her gun runs. Command had tried to bench her twice. Both times she talked her way back into the cockpit with a smile that never quite reached her eyes and a logbook that proved she got results when others couldn't. Now her aircraft sat on the ramp like a ghost ship, and nobody could explain how it had returned without her. The maintenance chief, a grizzled veteran named Ortega, stood beneath the wing and counted holes. He'd been working on A-10s for 23 years and had never seen anything like this. The aircraft should have fallen out of the sky. Should have been a crater somewhere in the Korangal Valley. Instead, it had navigated treacherous airspace, avoided Pakistani borders, and landed itself on a runway in the dark. The only explanation was that someone had been flying it until the very last possible moment. Someone who knew that aircraft better than they knew themselves. The question that hung over the base like smoke was simple and terrible. If Kairos had stayed with the aircraft that long, why wasn't she in it when it landed? And if she'd ejected, why hadn't her beacon activated? Search and rescue birds were already spinning up, but everyone who looked at that bullet-riddled Warthog knew the same cold truth. Nobody survived that kind of damage. Nobody walked away from a shoot-down in that terrain. Revenant had earned her call sign by coming back from missions that should have killed her. But even ghosts run out of luck eventually. The operations center at Bagram hummed with controlled chaos, as staff officers crowded around digital maps glowing with infrared overlays and satellite feeds. Major Takashi Brennan stood at the center, arms crossed, jaw tight. He'd been Kairos's squadron commander for 8 months, and had spent most of that time trying to keep her alive despite her best efforts to prove she was indestructible. The last known coordinates put her over the Pech River Valley, providing close air support for a special forces team pinned down by Taliban fighters. It was supposed to be a routine mission. Get in, suppress the enemy, get out. But Kairos never did routine. She'd gone in low, below the ridgelines, turning her aircraft into bait to draw fire away from the ground team. The radio recordings played back her voice, calm and precise even as tracer rounds lit up the sky around her. Groundhog 2-1, you're clear to move. I've got their attention. There was almost amusement in her tone, like she was enjoying the dance. Brennan replayed the final transmission for the 6th time. The way her voice changed in those last seconds, tension creeping in despite her training, the slight hitch when she said taking fire. Then the cutoff, so abrupt it felt like the world had been severed in half. The Special Forces team she'd been covering had made it out. All 8 men alive, minor injuries. They reported seeing her aircraft taking sustained anti-aircraft fire from multiple positions, watching as she deliberately drew the guns away from their position and into a narrow valley where the enemy thought they had her cornered. She was flying like she was angry, the team leader had said during his debrief, still wearing the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd nearly died. Like she wanted them to shoot at her. Intelligence estimated at least 4 Zu-23 anti-aircraft positions had opened up on her simultaneously. 23mm rounds traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, designed to tear apart aircraft. The A-10 was built to take punishment, but nothing was built to take that much. Brennan pulled up Kairos's personnel file on his tablet. The photo showed a woman with dark eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it, black hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and the hint of a scar along her left jawline. Greek-American, raised in Baltimore, joined the Marines at 19, top of her flight school class. 2 air medals, one for successfully landing a damaged aircraft under fire in Helmand Province. Known for aggressive tactics and an unsettling ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart. Also known for being difficult, she questioned orders she thought were tactically unsound, argued with senior officers about rules of engagement, flew missions other pilots refused because the risk was too high. Brennan had written her up twice for insubordination. He'd also recommended her for commendation 3 times. She was brilliant and impossible in equal measure. Her call sign told the story. Revenant, a spirit that returns from the dead. She'd earned it 2 years ago in Syria when her aircraft took an engine hit and everyone assumed she'd punch out. Instead, she'd nursed the crippled Warthog back to base on one engine, landed it with no hydraulics and walked away without a scratch. 3 weeks later, she was flying again, same aircraft, repaired and back in service. The search and rescue package launched at first light. 2 HH-60 Pave Hawks escorted by a pair of Apache gunships, racing northwest into terrain that had killed more American service members than anywhere else in Afghanistan. The mountains rose like jagged teeth, peaks still dusted with snow even in late spring. Villages clung to impossible slopes, and the valleys between them were mazes where insurgents had spent decades learning every cave, every trail, every place to hide. The lead Pave Hawk pilot, Captain Marcus Webb, kept his aircraft low and fast, following the river valleys where Kairos had last been tracked. His co-pilot worked the sensors, scanning for any sign of wreckage, any hint of a parachute, any transmission from a survival radio. They found the first debris field 17 miles from her last known position. Pieces of wing section scattered across a boulder field, metal twisted and scorched. Webb circled while his crew chief leaned out the door with binoculars, cataloging what he saw. Composite materials, hydraulic lines, sections of aileron, definitely A-10 parts, definitely recent, but no cockpit section, no ejection seat, no sign of the main fuselage. The aircraft had come apart in the air, shedding pieces as it fought to stay aloft. They followed the trail of debris like breadcrumbs, each piece telling part of the story. A stabilizer section wedged into a cliff face. Part of the landing gear assembly in a stream bed. The right engine nacelle, or what was left of it, buried nose first in a terraced poppy field. Whoever had been flying had somehow kept that disintegrating aircraft in the air for miles, coaxing it forward even as critical components failed and tore away. The rescue team pushed deeper into the valley, into areas where radio communication became spotty, and the maps showed villages marked as hostile. Webb's sensor operator suddenly called out a contact. Heat signature human-sized in a ravine 3 clicks ahead. Webb brought the helicopter around, his heart rate spiking. The Apache moved into overwatch position, scanning for threats. As they approached the ravine, the sensor operator refined the image. One figure prone, not moving. Webb felt his stomach drop. They'd been searching for 3 hours now, and hope had been slowly leaking away with each piece of wreckage they'd found. If they'd found her body, at least they could bring her home. That was something. Better than leaving her out here. The Pave Hawk descended into the ravine, rotor wash kicking up dust and loose stones. Webb held the aircraft in a hover while his pararescue jumper fast-stroked down, medical bag on his back. The PJ hit the ground running, moving toward the prone figure with his rifle up, scanning for threats. Then he stopped, keyed his radio. His voice came through with an edge of disbelief that made everyone on the net sit up straight. "I've got her. She's alive." Repeat, Revenant is alive and conscious. Webb nearly lost control of the collective. The crew chief let out a whoop that probably violated every radio protocol ever written. Even the Apache pilots broke their professional silence with surprised acknowledgments. The para-rescue jumper, Senior Airman Kyle Reston, knelt beside Kairos and had to remind himself to breathe. She was lying in a narrow crack between two boulders, partially covered with a torn parachute that had been arranged to provide shade and concealment. Her left leg was splinted with branches and what looked like pieces of her flight suit. Blood had soaked through bandages on her shoulder and abdomen, dark and dried, but her eyes were open, tracking him with sharp awareness despite obvious pain. "About time," she said, voice rough as gravel. "I've been here almost 4 hours." Reston couldn't help the laugh that escaped. 4 hours. She'd been shot down, survived a bailout over enemy territory, patched herself up, and waited for rescue with the patience of someone waiting for a late taxi. "Ma'am, I need to assess your injuries. Can you tell me what hurts?" "Everything hurts, Airman, but I can move my toes and I haven't coughed up blood, so we're ahead of the game." She tried to sit up and immediately went pale, breath hissing through her teeth. Reston gently pushed her back down. "Easy, Captain, let me do my job." He worked quickly, checking vitals, examining wounds. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder through and through. She'd packed it herself with gauze from her survival kit. Deep laceration on her abdomen, probably from shrapnel or cockpit debris during the ejection. Compound fracture of the left tibia, which explained the field splint. Multiple contusions and lacerations. She was dehydrated, borderline hypothermic despite the rising heat and running on nothing but adrenaline and spite. By all rights she should be unconscious or in shock. Instead she was giving him a look that suggested he was moving too slowly. "My aircraft," she said suddenly. "Did it make it back?" Reston paused, surprised by the question. "Yes, ma'am. Landed itself at Bagram about 3 hours ago." Something passed across her face then. Relief, satisfaction, maybe vindication. "Good. I told them the A-10 could take it. Nobody believed me. Ma'am, that bird had over 300 holes in it. Maintenance is calling it a miracle." "Not a miracle. Engineering. Fairchild Republic knew what they were doing when they built the Warthog." She winced as he secured her leg for transport. "How'd you find me? My beacon got destroyed when I punched out." "We followed the debris trail. Your bird left pieces across half the valley." She nodded slowly, like this made perfect sense. "I kept her flying as long as I could, needed distance from where I got hit, didn't want to land anywhere near those gun positions." Webb's voice crackled over Reston's headset. "We need to move. Local radio chatter is picking up. They know we're here." Reston looked up at the surrounding ridgelines, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. This ravine was a kill box if the enemy decided to engage. The extraction turned into a running gun battle before they'd even lifted off. Reston had just secured Kairos in the Pave Hawk's cabin when the first RPG streaked past the tail rotor, close enough that everyone felt the pressure wave. Webb didn't wait for permission. He yanked the helicopter into a climb, banking hard left as his co-pilot called out threats. "Multiple shooters, Ridgeline East, small arms and RPGs. We are taking fire." The Apache gunships rolled in immediately, their 30mm chain guns ripping into the hillside with mechanical precision. Reston crouched over Kairos, his body shielding hers as rounds pinged off the helicopter's armor plating. She was trying to sit up, trying to see what was happening, and he had to physically hold her down. "Stay down, ma'am. I can help. Let me see the tactical situation. You're injured and this isn't your aircraft. Stay down." Webb threw the Pave Hawk through a series of evasive maneuvers that had everyone's stomach in their throats, diving into another valley and using the terrain to break line of sight. Behind them, the Apache worked methodically, suppressing each firing position before it could do serious damage. The radio net was chaos. The second Pave Hawk reporting they were taking effective fire and breaking contact. One of the Apache calling out a technical vehicle mounting a heavy machine gun. Air controllers at Bagram scrambling to get fast movers airborne to provide top cover. Kairos listened to it all with intense focus, her tactical mind clearly working despite her injuries. "They're hurting you," she said suddenly. "What?" Reston had to lean close to hear her over the rotor noise. "The enemy. They're pushing you west. There's another ambush waiting." Webb's voice cut in over the intercom, tense. "How does she know that?" Kairos raised her voice, projecting through the pain. "Because that's what I would do. You chase the helicopters into a valley where they can't maneuver, then hit them from multiple sides. Webb, go north, follow the river drainage, steep banks, but you'll have cover. There was a moment of silence. Webb was the pilot, he was making the calls, and taking tactical advice from a wounded passenger was not protocol. But then Reston heard him key the intercom. Going north, hold on. The Pave Hawk banked sharply, following Kairos's guidance. 30 seconds later, the second helicopter reported taking heavy fire from the western valley, exactly where Kairos had predicted the ambush would be. They fought their way north for 20 miles, the Apache burning through ammunition to keep the enemy's heads down. Kairos stayed conscious the whole time, occasionally offering terse observations about terrain or likely enemy positions. Reston had done hundreds of combat rescues, pulled dozens of wounded soldiers from impossible situations, but he'd never seen anyone maintain this level of tactical awareness while dealing with injuries that should have put them into shock. Bagram's medical facility had been alerted and trauma teams were waiting when the Pave Hawk touched down. Reston stayed with Kairos as they rushed her into surgery, watching as doctors swarmed her with practiced efficiency. She grabbed his wrist before they put her under, grip surprisingly strong. "My crew chief, Ortega, tell him I'm sorry about the aircraft." "Ma'am, everyone's just glad you're alive." "Tell him anyway. He takes it personally when I break his birds." Then the anesthesia hit and she went under, that iron will finally releasing its grip. Reston stepped out of the surgical suite and found half the squadron waiting in the corridor. Major Brennan, several other pilots, ground crew, even a two-star general who'd flown in from Kandahar. They all wanted to know the same thing. How had she survived? Reston told them what he'd seen. The methodical self-treatment of her injuries, the tactical awareness during the extraction. The way she'd stayed focused on the mission even while bleeding out in a ravine. She never stopped being a pilot, he concluded. Even on the ground, even wounded, she was still thinking 3 steps ahead. Ortega, the crew chief, stood apart from the others, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When Reston delivered Kairos's message, the man's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "She always apologizes. Every time she brings back a bird full of holes, she apologizes. Like I'm going to be mad at her for surviving." He shook his head. "That A-10 should have killed her, should have broken apart at altitude and spread her across the mountains. Instead it kept flying. You know why?" Nobody answered. Ortega pointed at the surgical suite. "Because she wouldn't let it quit. The aircraft knew what was at stake. Sounds crazy, but I've worked on enough warthogs to know they've got personality. That bird brought itself home because its pilot wouldn't give up on it, so it wouldn't give up on her." Major Brennan stepped forward. "What's the prognosis?" A doctor emerged from the surgical suite, pulling off gloves. "She'll live. Shoulder wound missed the brachial artery by millimeters. Abdominal laceration required 43 stitches but no organ damage. Leg fracture is clean, should heal fine. She's incredibly lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Brennan said quietly. "That's skill, training, and something else I don't have a word for." The something else was what made Kairos different, what made her dangerous and valuable in equal measure. She didn't know how to quit, didn't have the survival instinct that told normal people when to back down. She saw every mission as something personal, every threat as a challenge to be met head-on. It made her a nightmare to command and a legend to fly with. The first person Kairos saw when she woke up was Ortega, sitting in a chair beside her hospital bed, reading a dog-eared paperback. He looked up when she stirred, closed the book, and regarded her with the expression of a disappointed parent. "You're grounded," he said. "Good morning to you too." Her voice came out hoarse, throat raw from the breathing tube during surgery. "I'm serious. 6 weeks minimum. Doctor's orders, backed by Major Brennan, backed by everyone with a rank high enough to make you listen." Kairos tried to laugh and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her ribs. 6 weeks. Taliban got lucky. Lucky. Captain, they shot your aircraft 317 times. We're still finding holes. The right engine had 12 rounds through the turbine section and somehow kept spinning. Your hydraulic system was running on fumes and prayers. Lucky doesn't cover what happened to you." She closed her eyes, remembering the way the aircraft had shuddered when the first rounds hit. The master caution panel lighting up like a Christmas tree, The flight controls getting heavier, less responsive, fighting her on every input. She'd known she was going down, had known it with the cold certainty that comes from experience and training. But she'd also known the Special Forces team on the ground was counting on her. If she left them exposed, they'd die. So she'd stayed, kept flying, kept drawing fire and putting ordnance on target until the aircraft simply couldn't continue. Even then, she'd fought to get distance before ejecting, had pointed the nose toward friendly territory and stayed with it until the last possible second. The team made it out, she said. All eight. All eight, Ortega confirmed. They're calling you a hero. I'm not a hero, I just did my job. Your job doesn't include nearly getting killed because you're too stubborn to break off when any sane pilot would have. She opened her eyes and fixed him with a look. Those men had families, kids. They were counting on me. What was I supposed to do, leave them? Ortega sighed. No, you were supposed to do exactly what you did, which is why everyone's terrified of you. You don't fight like you're trying to survive. You fight like you're trying to prove something. He wasn't wrong. Kairos had been proving something her entire career, proving she belonged in a cockpit despite the doubters, proving she could handle anything thrown at her, proving that she was every bit as capable as the men who questioned whether women should be combat pilots. Every mission was a referendum on her right to be there. Every time she came back, she'd earned one more day in the air. Over the next 2 weeks, as Kairos recovered, her story spread through the military community like wildfire. The bullet-riddled A-10 that flew itself home, the pilot who stayed with her dying aircraft to protect troops on the ground, the miraculous survival and extraction from deep behind enemy lines. Media outlets picked it up. Pentagon officials mentioned it in press briefings. Combat camera footage of the damaged Warthog sitting on the Bagram ramp went viral, racking up millions of views. People who knew nothing about aviation could look at those 300 holes and understand what they meant. Kairos hated every second of the attention. She'd give interviews through clenched teeth, offering brief tactical summaries while deflecting attempts to make her into some kind of symbol. I'm not special. Any pilot in my squadron would have done the same thing. But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. Not every pilot had her particular combination of skill, aggression, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. The Special Forces team she'd saved sent her a handwritten letter, 8 signatures at the bottom, thanking her for giving them a chance to see their families again. She kept it folded in her flight suit pocket and never mentioned it to anyone. Major Brennan visited regularly, usually bringing updates on squadron operations that he knew she wanted to hear. On the 10th day, he brought something else, a small wooden box with a simple latch. The maintenance crews made this for you, he said, setting it on her hospital bed. They wanted you to have it. Inside was a piece of the A-10's fuselage, about the size of a playing card, mounted on a plaque. The metal was riddled with bullet holes and scorched from fire damage. Oh, at a brass plate read, to Captain Lyra Kairos, Revenant, the sky tried to kill you, the enemy tried to kill you, your own aircraft tried to kill you, you made it home anyway, the grateful crew chiefs who have to fix your messes. Kairos stared at it for a long moment, then despite herself she smiled. Tell them they misspelled grateful. They didn't misspell anything. Grateful has 1 L, this has 2. Brennan leaned over to look. You're right, that's embarrassing, I'll tell them. Don't. It's perfect the way it is. He studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't seen before. Maybe satisfaction, maybe peace. When you're clear to fly again, I'm putting you up for instructor duty, stateside, training new A-10 pilots. Her head snapped up. Sir, with respect, I'm a combat pilot. That's where I belong. You're a combat pilot who's survived things that should have killed her multiple times. That means you have knowledge worth passing on. And frankly, Captain, you've done enough. You've earned the right to step back. The argument that followed was legendary. Kairos, still in her hospital bed with a leg in a cast and stitches holding her together, going toe-to-toe with her squadron commander about what she would and wouldn't do with her career. Brennan stood his ground, arguing that she'd proven her point a dozen times over and didn't need to keep risking her life. Kairos countered that she was a combat pilot, not a teacher, and sending her stateside would be wasting her experience. The debate raged for 20 minutes, voices rising despite the hospital setting, until finally Kairos played the card she'd been holding in reserve. "You need me here, Major. You know you do. When the new pilots arrive and they're scared and they don't think they can handle it, who are they going to believe? Some instructor who's been stateside for years, or the pilot who took 300 rounds and walked away?" Brennan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. She had him, and they both knew it. 6 months, he said finally. "You finish your recovery, you do 6 more months with the squadron, then we revisit the instructor position. Deal? Deal." They shook on it, Kairos's grip firm despite the shoulder injury. After Brennan left, she lay back and stared at the ceiling, wondering if she'd made the right choice. Part of her knew he was right. She'd pushed her luck too many times. Eventually, the odds would catch up with her. But another part, the part that had kept her in the cockpit through fire and pain and certain death, couldn't imagine doing anything else. Flying wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. A nurse came by to check her vitals, a young Army specialist who'd been working the ward for 3 months. "You're that pilot," she said. "Everyone's talking about you." "I'm just a pilot," Kairos replied, her standard deflection. "My cousin wanted to be a pilot. She scored high enough on the tests, but—" The nurse trailed off. "But what?" "She got told it wasn't really for women, that she should consider something else." Kairos felt a familiar anger kindle in her chest. "What's your cousin's name?" "Emily Ramos. Tell Emily that anyone who says flying isn't for women is wrong and doesn't understand history. Tell her WASP pilots were ferrying bombers across the Atlantic when the men who doubted them couldn't find their way across Nebraska. Tell her the aircraft doesn't care about gender, it cares about skill, and if she wants it bad enough, she should take it." The nurse smiled. "I will. Thank you, Captain." After she left, Kairos thought about all the young women who'd been told they didn't belong in cockpits, told they weren't strong enough, aggressive enough, technically minded enough. Every time she flew, every time she came back, she was proving those voices wrong. Physical therapy was brutal. Kairos attacked it with the same intensity she brought to flying, pushing through pain that would have stopped most people. Her leg had to be rebuilt through exercise and willpower, range of motion earned back one agonizing degree at a time. The therapist, a Marine Corps veteran named Torres who'd lost his own leg in Fallujah, didn't accept excuses. "You want to fly again? Then you work, every day. No exceptions." She worked. Sessions that were supposed to last an hour stretched to 2 because Kairos refused to quit until she'd hit her targets. Other patients watched in awe or concern as she forced her damaged body to remember what it could do. Torres pushed her hard but fairly. He understood what drove her. "You're not afraid of the pain," he observed one afternoon, watching her grimace through a particularly difficult exercise. "You're afraid of being grounded. Wouldn't you be? I was grounded permanently. Medical retirement, so yeah, I get it." He adjusted the resistance on the machine she was using. "But here's what I learned. Being able to walk again, run again, live without pain, that's worth fighting for too, not just so you can get back in the cockpit, for yourself." Kairos didn't respond immediately, focusing on the exercise. Finally she said, "I don't know who I am if I'm not flying." "Then maybe it's time to figure that out." It was good advice. She ignored it. Her identity was so wrapped up in being a pilot, in being Revenant, that contemplating any other version of herself felt like surrender. She'd fought too hard to get where she was, sacrificed too much, given up relationships, stability, any sense of a normal life, all for the privilege of strapping into an A-10 and taking the fight to the enemy. The thought of walking away felt like betraying everyone who'd told her she couldn't do it in the first place. After 6 weeks, she passed her medical evaluation. The doctor had reservations, nodding that her recovery was remarkable but not complete, that she should consider taking more time. Kairos thanked him for his concern and reported back to flight status the next day. The squadron had changed in her absence. New pilots had rotated in, young faces who'd heard the stories but hadn't flown with her. They watched her with a mixture of reverence and nervousness, unsure how to approach a living legend. The older pilots, the ones who'd been there, treated her differently now. The casual mockery that had characterized their earlier interactions was gone, replaced by respect that felt almost uncomfortable. She'd crossed some invisible line, stopped being just another aggressive pilot and become something else. Her first flight back was a local training sortie, nothing combat-related, just a chance to shake off the rust and prove she could still handle the aircraft. Ortega did the pre-flight inspection himself, checking every system twice, clearly nervous about putting her back in the air. "She's in perfect shape," he assured Kairos as she climbed into the cockpit. "Better than new. We rebuilt half the systems after your last adventure. I'll try to bring her back clean this time." "You better." "I'm running out of spare parts." The canopy closed, systems powered up. Kairos ran through her checklist with mechanical precision, muscle memory taking over. Engine start was smooth. Radio checks clear, everything felt right. She taxied to the runway, received clearance, and pushed the throttles forward. The accelerated with its characteristic deliberate power, no grace or elegance, just pure functional force. Nose came up, wheels left the ground, and suddenly she was flying again. The world dropped away beneath her, and for the first time in weeks, Kairos felt like herself. The pain, the media attention, the uncomfortable hero worship, all of it faded into insignificance. Up here at 8,000 feet with the Hindu Kush spread out below like a topographic map, everything made sense. She put the A-10 through a series of maneuvers, testing both the aircraft and herself. Aileron rolls, steep turns, emergency procedures. The plane responded perfectly. Her body, still healing, complained about the G-forces but held up. By the time she returned to base an hour later, she was grinning despite herself. The landing was smooth. She taxied back to the ramp where Ortega waited with his arms crossed, trying to look stern and failing. "How'd she handle?" he called as the engine spun down. "Like she missed me." "Aircraft don't miss people, Captain. This one does." Over the following weeks, Kairos eased back into combat operations. First as wingman on simple missions, then increasingly complex sorties. She'd expected some psychological aftermath from the shoot-down, maybe hesitation or fear when taking fire. Instead, she found herself calmer than before. She'd looked death in the face and outlasted it, had stayed conscious and effective through injuries that should have incapacitated her. There was a confidence that came from surviving the worst-case scenario. The new pilots watched her closely, learning not from briefings but from observation. They noticed how she positioned her aircraft to maximize visibility for ground forces, how she communicated with controllers, precise and efficient, how she never seemed hurried or stressed, even when situations deteriorated. Call signs were supposed to be jokes or insults, but Revenant fit her too perfectly to be either. The mission that defined her legacy came 3 months after her return to flight status. A Marine patrol had been ambushed in a remote valley, taking casualties, pinned down by insurgents in fortified positions. The call for air support went out and Kairos was airborne within minutes, leading a 2-ship flight into terrain so treacherous that other pilots had declined the mission. Her wingman, a young captain named Marcus Vega, had been in country for 2 weeks. He followed her into the valley with his heart hammering, watching as she descended below the ridgelines where surface-to-air threats waited. "Revenant lead, Groundhog 4-1. We have wounded. Need immediate suppression. Grid follows." The Marines on the ground were desperate. Kairos could hear it in the forward air controller's voice, the tight control barely masking panic. She rolled in on the first gun run without hesitation. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon roared, 7-barrel Gatling gun spitting 30mm rounds at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The sound was distinctive, a deep grinding buzz that earned the aircraft its Warthog nickname. Insurgent positions disintegrated under the onslaught. She pulled up, called her wingman in. "Revenant 2, hit the tree line north of the road. Watch for RPGs." Vega made his run, less precise than Kairos but effective. Together they worked the valley methodically, suppressing enemy positions while the Marines moved their wounded to an extraction point. Then the familiar sound of a master caution alarm. Kairos glanced at her warning panel, hydraulic pressure dropping. She'd taken a hit. "Revenant 2, I'm showing hydraulic failure, staying on station." Brennan's voice cut in from the command post. "Revenant lead RTB immediately. We'll send another package." "Negative. Marines still taking fire. I'm still mission capable." "Captain, that's an order." Kairos didn't respond, instead rolling in for another gun run. The A-10's redundant systems allowed her to keep flying, manual reversion giving her just enough control. Vega watched in disbelief as she continued working the target area, refusing to leave until the last Marine was loaded into the medevac helicopter. Only then did she turn for home, aircraft damaged but flyable, mission accomplished despite the hit. She landed with no hydraulics, using pure muscle to control the aircraft through emergency procedures. When she finally shut down and climbed out, there was fluid leaking from half a dozen places and Ortega looked ready to have a stroke. You flew combat with a hydraulic failure. I flew carefully with a hydraulic failure. There's a difference. Captain, I swear to God, you're going to give me a heart attack. But he was smiling when he said it. The Marines she'd covered sent a delegation to thank her personally. 8 men, one with his arm in a sling, another walking with a cane, all alive because she'd refused to leave them. Their sergeant, a weathered veteran with 20 years in, shook her hand and said simply, "You didn't quit on us. We won't forget that." Neither would anyone else who heard the story. Kairos had become more than just a skilled pilot. She'd become a symbol of something larger, a representation of the warrior ethos that said you never leave your people behind, never quit when the mission matters, never let fear make your decisions. Young pilots wanted to fly like her. Ground troops wanted her call sign in the air when things went bad. Even the skeptics who doubted her ability had been forced to acknowledge her exceptional skill and courage. But with that recognition came pressure. Every flight now carried the weight of expectation. She wasn't just responsible for her own performance anymore. She was representing something, whether she wanted to or not. The attention became suffocating. Media requests piled up. Senior officers wanted her at photo opportunities. Some politician mentioned her name in a speech about women in combat. She declined everything she could and endured the rest with barely concealed discomfort. Brennan tried to run interference, but there were some things even a squadron commander couldn't block. "You're a symbol now," he told her after a particularly tedious press event. "I never wanted to be a symbol, I wanted to be a pilot. You're both. Welcome to being exceptional. It comes with responsibilities you didn't ask for." She understood what he was saying, but understanding didn't make it easier. Every time someone called her a hero or an inspiration, she felt like a fraud. She'd just done her job. The fact that her job involved getting shot at and nearly dying didn't make it heroic in her mind. It made it Tuesday. Lieutenant Yuki Nakamura approached her one evening in the operations center. Young, fresh out of flight school, nervous about her first deployment. "Captain Kairos, can I ask you something? Make it quick. How do you handle the fear, before missions, knowing you might not come back?" Kairos looked at the young pilot, seeing her own younger self reflected there. She could offer some platitude about training and confidence. Instead, she decided on truth. "You never stop being afraid, you just learn to do your job despite it. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you from getting complacent. The day you stop being afraid is the day you get killed." Nakamura absorbed this, nodded slowly. "Thank you, ma'am. One more thing, Lieutenant, don't try to fly like me. I'm aggressive because I've got the experience to back it up. You're still learning. Be smart, be safe, and build your skills. There's no award for dying heroically." As her 6-month extension approached its end, Kairos found herself at a crossroads. Brennan hadn't forgotten their agreement and the instructor position was waiting stateside. Part of her wanted to stay in the fight, keep flying combat missions, maintain the identity she'd built. But another part, smaller but growing, recognized that Tor's the physical therapist had been right. She needed to figure out who she was beyond the cockpit. The decision crystallized during a routine patrol. She was flying with Nakamura as her wingman, showing the young pilot how to work a particular valley that had tricky wind patterns. As they flew, Kairos found herself explaining not just the mechanics but the philosophy, the way to read terrain and anticipate threats and stay 3 steps ahead of the tactical situation. Nakamura was a quick study, asking smart questions and demonstrating good instincts. Watching her learn, Kairos realized this mattered too. Maybe more than adding one more mission to her logbook. If she could pass on even a fraction of what she'd learned through pain and experience, if she could help these young pilots survive and succeed, wasn't that worth something? When they landed, she found Brennan in his office. "About that instructor position," she said. "I'm interested." He looked up. genuine surprise on his face. "What changed your mind?" "Someone reminded me that I'm not just responsible for myself anymore. These kids are going to fly with or without my help. I'd rather they do it with." Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're sure? This isn't you trying to do what you think people expect?" "No, this is me recognizing that I've done the combat thing. I've proven whatever I needed to prove. Now maybe it's time to make sure the next generation doesn't have to learn everything the hard way. They'll be lucky to have you, though you might want to work on being less terrifying." Terrifying keeps them focused. She allowed herself a small smile. "Besides, someone has to make sure they learn to fly the Warthog properly." The paperwork was processed within a week. Orders cut for Davis Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, home of the 355th Fighter Wing, where she trained the next generation of A-10 pilots. Ortega took the news harder than anyone, claiming she was abandoning him just when he'd trained her to stop breaking his aircraft. 23 years I've been working on Warthogs," he said. "Never had a pilot like you, probably never will again. You'll survive, and you won't have to work weekends anymore. Weekends were the only time I got to fix all the damage you caused during the week." They shook hands, both knowing this was goodbye in a way that mattered. Her final mission was a simple patrol, nothing dramatic, just one more flight over the mountains she'd come to know intimately. Vega flew as her wingman, a fitting symmetry since he'd been with her during her first mission back after recovery. The Hindu Kush stretched out below them in the afternoon light, peaks casting long shadows across valleys where men had fought and died for thousands of years. Kairos looked down at terrain that had tried to kill her and failed, felt the respond to her touch on the controls, and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd done her part, flown her missions, brought her people home. The radio crackled. "Revenant Lead Groundhog 76, got eyes on your bird. Thanks for keeping us safe up there." She smiled, keying the mic. "Groundhog 76, Revenant Lead, it's been an honor. Revenant Flight is RTB." The return to base was smooth. One last landing. One last post-flight inspection with Ortega, noting every minor discrepancy with exaggerated concern. One last walk across the ramp in her flight suit, knowing she'd done this hundreds of times and wouldn't do it here again. The squadron threw her a send-off party, the kind of rowdy affair where pilots told exaggerated stories and pretended the beer wasn't terrible. Brennan presented her with a plaque, the squadron crest surrounded by signatures from everyone she'd flown with. "To Revenant," he said, raising his cup. "The pilot who proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's flying the mission anyway. May you terrify student pilots for years to come." They drank to that. Later, after the party wound down, Kairos stood alone on the flight line, looking at the row of A-10s parked in their revetments. These ugly, beautiful, deadly aircraft that had become an extension of herself. She'd miss this. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. The weight of the helmet and harness. The moment when wheels left the ground and suddenly everything else fell away. But she wouldn't miss the pressure of being Revenant, living legend, symbol of something larger than herself. Maybe stateside she could just be Lyra Kairos again. Find out what that meant. The flight to Arizona was commercial, no drama, just another passenger in transit. She watched the landscape change below, brown mountains giving way to desert, trying not to calculate her altitude and heading out of habit. At Davis Monthan, the welcome was professional but distant. She was just another new instructor checking in, her reputation preceding her but not overwhelming. The other instructors were veterans themselves, people who'd seen combat and survived, and they treated her as an equal rather than a celebrity. She appreciated that more than they could know. Teaching proved harder than flying combat. Kairos had spent years developing instincts and reflexes that she couldn't easily articulate. Trying to break down split-second decisions into steps that could be taught was like trying to explain how to breathe. The students were eager but terrified, which she understood. The A-10 was an unforgiving aircraft, and the missions they'd eventually fly would put them in harm's way. Her first class had 12 pilots, ranging from fresh flight school graduates to experienced aviators transitioning from other aircraft. She stood before them in a bland classroom at 600 and decided to skip the prepared curriculum. "Show of hands, how many of you know who I am?" All 12 hands went up. How many of you are worried you can't live up to that standard? After a pause, 8 hands rose slowly. Good, you should be worried. The A-10 is a combat aircraft flown in the most dangerous environments in military aviation. Low and slow over hostile territory, close enough to see the people shooting at you. Some of you will take hits. Some of you will have to make impossible decisions while your aircraft is falling apart around you. And all of you will be responsible for lives on the ground who are counting on you not to quit. She let that sink in. I'm not here to make you into copies of me. I'm here to give you the skills to survive and succeed on your own terms. Every pilot is different. Every mission is different. What worked for me might get you killed. So we're going to start with fundamentals, and we're going to build from there, and you're going to learn to trust your training and your instincts. Over the following months, she discovered she had a gift for instruction, not through gentle encouragement, but through demanding excellence and refusing to accept half measures. Students who thought they'd reached their limits found themselves pushed further, discovering capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. She was hard but fair, critical but never cruel. When Lieutenant Sarah Acaffer froze during a simulated emergency, panicking as the simulator threw multiple failures at her, Kairos stopped the exercise and took her aside. What happened up there? I got overwhelmed. Too many things going wrong at once. There will always be too many things going wrong at once. That's why we prioritize. What's the most important thing in any emergency? Flying the aircraft. Flying the aircraft. Everything else is secondary. You can lose hydraulics, lose an engine, have every warning light in the cockpit screaming at you, but if you fly the aircraft, you have a chance. The moment you forget that, you're done. She pulled up the simulator recording. Watch. Here's where you started fixating on the hydraulic failure. You spent 30 seconds trying to diagnose it while the aircraft drifted off heading and lost 500 feet of altitude. See, Acaffer watched, nodding slowly. I should have maintained control first, then troubleshot. Exactly. Let's run it again. Word spread about Kairos's teaching methods. She was demanding but effective, producing pilots who could handle pressure and think critically under stress. The washout rate from her courses was higher than average, but the pilots who made it through were exceptional. Not everyone appreciated her approach. Some students complained she was too harsh, too unforgiving of mistakes. A few requested transfer to other instructors. Kairos didn't try to stop them. She knew her style wasn't for everyone, and she'd rather they figure that out in training than during their first combat mission. Captain Devon Wright, one of her more promising students, approached her after a particularly brutal day of training. "Ma'am, can I ask why you're so hard on us? Would you rather I be easy on you here and you die over there?" "No, ma'am." "Then you have your answer." But that night, alone in her quarters, she wondered if she was pushing too hard. Trying to recreate herself in these young pilots instead of letting them find their own paths. The line between demanding excellence and demanding the impossible was thinner than she'd like to admit. The next day she adjusted her approach. Still demanding, still refusing to accept mediocrity, but allowing more room for individual style and decision-making. She began to see her role not as creating copies of Revenant, but as giving each pilot the tools to become their own version of excellent. The change was subtle but significant. Students relaxed fractionally, became more willing to experiment and learn from mistakes. The ones who'd been intimidated found their confidence. The cocky ones learned humility without being crushed. It was the balance she'd been searching for. 6 months into her instructor assignment, she received a message that Lieutenant Nakamura, the young pilot she'd mentored in Afghanistan, had been shot down over Syria. Medical evacuation successful, pilot recovered with minor injuries. Kairos stared at the message, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. Another pilot who'd looked up to her, another person flying into danger, another roll of the dice where the outcome could go either way. She pulled up Nakamura's service record. Multiple successful combat missions since their time together. 2 air medals. A reputation for solid tactical decision-making. Whatever she'd taught the young pilot had stuck. Nakamura had survived because she'd been well-trained and kept her head. That mattered. That meant something. Kairos realized she was building a legacy that extended beyond her own flying. Every pilot she trained, every lesson that stuck, every life saved because someone remembered what she'd taught them, that was immortality of a kind. The years passed. Kairos rotated through instructor roles, advancing to check pilot, then evaluator, then finally to head of the A-10 training squadron. She'd become part of the institutional knowledge of the aircraft, one of the voices that defined what Warthog pilots were supposed to be. Her class photos lined the squadron halls, dozens of young faces that had passed through her hands. She tracked their careers when she could, felt pride when they excelled and grief when they didn't come home. The bullet-riddled piece of fuselage from her aircraft stayed mounted on her office wall, a reminder of where she'd been and what she'd survived. New instructors would ask about it, and she'd give them the abbreviated version. Just enough to establish credibility, not enough to turn it into legend. At 43, she was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the entire training wing. It was a desk job, mostly administrative work, that took her further from the cockpit. She accepted it with mixed feelings, recognizing this was the natural progression of a military career, but missing the immediate impact of teaching. One afternoon, reviewing personnel files, she noticed a name that stopped her cold. Lieutenant Emily Ramos, new student pilot, top of her flight school class, assigned to attend training. The name echoed from years ago, a conversation in a hospital room about a cousin who'd been told flying wasn't for women. Kairos pulled up Ramos's file. 24 years old, born in Texas, stellar academic record, perfect flight evaluations. The photo showed a young woman with determined eyes and the hint of a smile, like she knew a secret the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. On Ramos's first day, Kairos made a point of attending the welcome briefing. She watched the new students file in, nervous and excited, carrying the weight of their own doubts and dreams. When Ramos entered, Kairos saw the moment of recognition in her eyes. After the briefing, Ramos approached hesitantly. "Colonel Kairos, I don't know if you remember, but your cousin was a nurse at Bagram. She told you that flying wasn't for women, and I told you she was wrong." Ramos's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am, that conversation changed my life. I stopped listening to people who said I couldn't do it and started proving I could." "Good. Now prove it again. This training is going to be the hardest thing you've done. Some people will doubt you. Some people will want you to fail just to validate their biases. Don't give them the satisfaction." "I won't, ma'am. And Lieutenant, when you graduate and they ask you who inspired you to fly, don't say it was me. Say it was yourself. I just confirmed what you already knew." Ramos nodded, understanding the distinction. She walked away with her shoulders back, ready for whatever came next. Kairos watched her go and felt something shift. For years she'd been carrying the weight of being revenant, living up to impossible standards, representing something larger than herself. But maybe that was the wrong way to think about it. Maybe the point wasn't to be an untouchable legend. Maybe it was to be a reminder that excellence was achievable, that doubters could be proven wrong, that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. She wasn't special. She just refused to quit. And now she was teaching others to do the same. That evening, Kairos drove out to the aircraft boneyard at Davis-Monthan, where hundreds of retired military aircraft sat in the desert sun. Row after row of warbirds, from Vietnam-era fighters to modern jets, all awaiting their final disposition. She walked among them, touching sun-hot metal, remembering what each type had contributed to military aviation. Near the back, she found a small section of A-10s. Earlier models that had been retired as newer variants came online. She stood before one, looking at the familiar lines, the massive engine nacelles, the nose that housed that terrible gun. This aircraft had flown combat missions, had protected troops on the ground, had come home full of holes more than once. Now it sat silent in the desert, its war over, its purpose fulfilled. She placed her hand on the fuselage, feeling the heat radiating from the metal. "Thank you," she said quietly, not caring if anyone heard, "for keeping me alive, for doing your job even when it seemed impossible, for being exactly what you were built to be." The aircraft had no response, being aluminum and titanium and engineering, but Kairos felt like it understood anyway. She turned and walked back to her car, leaving the old warriors to their rest. Her war was over too, at least the part where she flew combat missions. But her mission continued in a different form. Every student who graduated, every pilot who survived because of the skills she taught them, that was her combat now. That was how she continued to fight. Back at the squadron, she found a message waiting. Nakamura had been promoted to captain and was returning stateside to become an instructor. She was requesting assignment to Kairos's wing, wanting to give back the way she'd been given to. Kairos smiled and approved the request. The cycle continued. Those who'd been taught became teachers. Those who'd been saved became saviors. The chain of knowledge and experience passing from one generation to the next, each link tested by fire, each connection forged through shared understanding of what it meant to fly and fight and survive. At the end of that long day, Kairos stood at her office window and watched the sun set over the flight line. Student pilots were practicing approaches, touch and goes, the eternal rhythm of training. Each one of those aircraft carried someone's child, someone's dream, someone's determination to prove themselves worthy. Her job was to make sure they had every possible advantage when the real test came. She'd been Revenant, the ghost who couldn't be killed, the legend who proved that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. Now she was something more important. She was the person who made sure there would be more Revenants, more pilots who refused to quit, more warriors who understood that excellence wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and doing the job anyway. The sky darkened. The last student pilot landed and taxied clear. Another day of training complete, another group of aviators one step closer to being ready. Kairos turned from the window, sat at her desk, and began reviewing the next day's schedule. There was always more work to do, always more to teach, always another mission, even if the missions looked different now. She'd made her peace with that, had learned, finally, that identity wasn't just about what you did in the cockpit. It was about what you left behind when you climbed out for the last time. Her legacy wouldn't be measured in combat missions or medals or bullet holes survived. It would be measured in the pilots who carried forward the lessons she'd taught, who flew with skill and courage because someone had shown them how. That was immortality worth having. That was a mission worth flying. The story of Revenant hadn't ended when she left Afghanistan. It had multiplied, spreading through every pilot she trained, every lesson that took root, every moment when someone remembered what she taught them and used it to survive. She was no longer just one pilot. She was an idea, a standard, a reminder of what was possible when you refused to accept limitations. And that, she finally understood, was the real victory. Not surviving the impossible, teaching others how to do it too.